The morning they buried Walter Harlan, the sky over Kenton, Ohio, was the color of old pewter. Not dramatic, not stormy, just flat and gray and indifferent the way the sky gets in early November, when it has nothing left to prove. Dorothy stood at the edge of the cemetery in a black coat she hadn't worn since her sister's funeral 11 years ago. It still fit. That surprised her. So much had changed, and yet the coat still fit. She watched the casket being lowered. She watched the minister speak words she couldn't quite hear from where she stood, not because she was too far away, but because something inside her had gone quiet, a kind of internal silence she hadn't experienced before. Not grief exactly, something deeper than grief, something that had no name yet. Walter's children stood closer to the grave. Prescott, the eldest, in a dark suit that cost more than Dorothy's first car. He had Walter's jaw and none of Walter's warmth. Beside him, his sister Marlene, arms folded, expressions sealed. Two others whose names Dorothy could never keep straight. They had their father's height and their mother's coldness, the first wife Barbara dead 14 years now, but somehow still present in the way her children occupied space, in the way they looked through Dorothy rather than at her, 42 years. Walter had lived, 15 of them with Dorothy, 15 years, and she was standing at the edge of his funeral like a neighbor who happened to be passing by. The minister finished. Someone played something on a portable speaker, a hymn Dorothy didn't recognize. People drifted toward the cars in small clusters, speaking in the hushed, efficient tones of people who had places to be. A few of them shook Dorothy's hand. Firm, brief handshakes. The kind you give when you want to acknowledge something without actually touching it. So sorry for your loss. He was a good man. If there's anything you need. And there never was anything they needed her to do. That was the thing about condolences. They sounded like offers, but they were really just exits. A way to close a door gently without making a sound. By the time the last car pulled out of the cemetery, Dorothy was alone. She stood there for a while longer, not because she was grieving in the way movies showed, no tears, no trembling, no falling to her knees in the mud. She stood there because she didn't know where to go next. The house on Clover Street had been Walter's. His name on the deed, his name on the mortgage, his name on everything that had accumulated over 15 years of marriage. She had known this. She had always known this, in the abstract way you know something that doesn't feel real until suddenly it is. She picked up her canvas bag. One bag, everything she'd thought to grab before Prescott's lawyer called and told her the estate proceedings would begin the following morning, and she walked to her car. The law office of Hembry and Associates sat on the second floor of a building on Main Street that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and old paper. Dorothy arrived 7 minutes early. She sat in a chair near the window and watched a pigeon walk back and forth on the ledge outside with the calm, purposeful energy of something that had nowhere to be and didn't mind at all. She envied the pigeon. Prescott arrived at 9 on the dot with two people Dorothy didn't recognize, a woman in a charcoal blazer carrying a leather portfolio, and a younger man who looked like he'd been hired specifically to stand slightly behind important people and say nothing. The lawyer, a man named Hembry, with reading glasses perpetually perched on his forehead, came out to greet them with a handshake that told Dorothy everything she needed to know about where the relationships in this room had been built. She had not been part of those relationships. They sat around a conference table that was too large for the number of people in the room. Hembry laid out papers. He used words like estate, distribution, impending valuation, in the smooth, practiced cadence of someone who had delivered versions of this same speech many times and had long since stopped thinking about what the words meant to the people receiving them. The house on Clover Street to Prescott and Marlene in joint tenancy. The savings accounts, 3 of them totaling just over $218,000, divided equally among the 4 children per the terms of the will. Walter's truck, his tools, the small workshop behind the house to Prescott. Dorothy's car, the one she'd driven for 6 years, the one she'd chosen herself. One with the crack in the passenger side mirror she'd always meant to get fixed, was technically also Walter's, purchased under his name during a year when their finances had been pooled in a way that made everything his without either of them really noticing. Hembry glanced at her over his reading glasses. "Mrs. Harlan, there is one item specifically designated for you." Prescott shifted in his chair. Just barely, just enough. Hembry slid a small envelope across the table. Plain white. Dorothy's first name, written on the front in blue ink, she recognized immediately. Walter's handwriting slightly cramped on the left side the way it always was, his pen pressing harder than it needed to. She didn't open it right away. "That's everything?" she asked. "That's everything," Hembry said. She looked at the envelope. She looked at Prescott, who was looking at the window. She looked at the woman in the charcoal blazer, who was looking at her phone. "All right," Dorothy said. She stood, picked up an envelope, tucked it into the pocket of her black coat, and walked out of the conference room with her chin level and her footsteps quiet. Behind her, she heard Prescott say something in a low voice. She didn't catch the words. She caught the tone. The tone was the same one she'd heard at the cemetery, the sound of a door being closed gently, efficiently, without any particular emotion. She didn't look back. She sat in her car in the parking lot behind the building for a long time before she opened the envelope. The November light was thin and flat, coming through the windshield at an angle that lit up all the dust on the dashboard. Dorothy noticed that. She noticed it the way you notice small things when the large things are too large to look at directly. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in thirds. No letter, no explanation, no "I'm sorry" or "I love you" or "Here is what I couldn't say out loud." Just an address written in Walter's blue ink. Hollow Creek Road, rural Route 4, Hardin County, Ohio. Dorothy stared at it. She knew Hardin County. She'd driven through it once years ago on the way to somewhere else. It was flat farmland and tree lines and small towns that appeared and disappeared along the highway like afterthoughts. She did not know any road called Hollow Creek. She typed the address into her phone. No results. She tried a different map application, then a third. Nothing. The street didn't exist. Not in any database she could find, not in any satellite image, not in any directory of Hardin County roads she could pull up in the next 20 minutes of sitting in that parking lot with the November sun moving slowly across the windshield. A road that didn't exist. Dorothy folded the paper and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in her pocket. She started the car, drove out of the parking lot, and turned in the direction of nowhere in particular, because for the first time in 15 years, all directions were equally possible and equally empty. She found a supermarket on the west side of Kenton and parked in the far corner of the lot near the cart return, where the lights didn't quite reach. She turned off the engine. She sat in the dark with her hands in her lap. In the back seat, a neatly folded blanket, a small bag of clothes, 3 days' worth, maybe 4 if she was careful, a toiletry bag, the photo of Walter from their first trip to the Tennessee mountains, back when they were still figuring out what they were to each other before words like husband and wife had settled over them like something permanent. She hadn't taken much. There hadn't been time, and there hadn't been much that was hers to take. 15 years. And this was what remained of them. She didn't cry. She wanted to in an abstract way, the way you want something you can't quite locate. The tears were there somewhere. She could feel the weight of them. But they didn't come, and after a while she stopped waiting for them. Instead, she pulled the envelope out of her pocket again and looked at the address in the thin light from a distant parking lot lamp. Hollow Creek Road, rural Route 4, Hardin County, Ohio. Walter's handwriting, slightly cramped on the left. Blue ink, the same pen he'd used for grocery lists and crossword puzzles and birthday cards that always said more than he meant to say out loud. "What were you thinking?" she said quietly to the empty car. "What on earth were you thinking?" No answer. Of course no answer. That was the thing about the dead, they left you with all the questions and none of the conversations. She thought about calling someone. Her daughter from her first marriage, Claire, who lived in Portland now, and called on birthdays and at Christmas and would absolutely come if Dorothy asked, would fly in and hold her hand and make tea and say all the right things. Dorothy did not call her, not because she didn't love Claire, but because she wasn't ready for the right things yet. She wasn't ready for someone else's certainty. She put the seat back as far as it would go, pulled the blanket from the back seat over herself and closed her eyes. Sleep came in fragments, thin and restless. At some point in the deep middle of the night, she heard a shopping cart rolling across the empty lot, pushed by the wind, the small metallic rattling of it moving through the silence like something that had gotten loose and didn't know where it was going. She understood that cart completely. By morning, the cold had settled into the car. In the way November cold does not, dramatically, just gradually, insistently, until it was simply the condition of everything. Dorothy's breath was visible. Her feet were numb inside her shoes. She drove out of the lot just after 6 and found a diner 2 miles down the highway, Patsy's, according to the hand-painted sign, with a coffee cup drawn next to the name that had faded until the cup looked more like a ghost of a cup. But the lights were on, and there were 2 trucks in the parking lot, and that was enough. Inside, the warmth hit her like something physical. The smell of coffee and bacon grease, and something sweet baking in the back. The kind of diner that had been exactly this diner for 30 years and had no intention of changing vinyl counter stools, laminated menus, a small television mounted in the corner, showing a weather forecast with the volume too low to hear. Dorothy sat at the counter. A woman about her age, sturdy, silver-haired, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this exact job for decades, set a coffee mug in front of her without being asked. "Just coffee to start," the woman said. Her name tag read Vera. "Please," Dorothy said. Vera filled the mug and moved away. Dorothy wrapped both hands around the ceramic, feeling the heat work its way into her palms and then her fingers, and she sat there doing nothing else for a while, just receiving the warmth. After a few minutes, she reached into her coat pocket and took out the envelope. She unfolded the paper and smoothed it on the counter with the flat of her hand. Vera came back to refill the coffee and paused. "You need to order, or you still thinking?" she asked, not unkindly. "Still thinking," Dorothy said. "Then, have you ever heard of a road called Hollow Creek out in Hardin County somewhere? Rural Route 4. Vera set the coffee pot down on the counter and leaned slightly forward, looking at the paper. Her expression shifted in a way that was small but unmistakable, something between recognition and caution. "You're looking for that road," Vera said. "I'm trying to find it. It doesn't show up on any map I can find." Vera was quiet for a moment. She picked up the coffee pot in as if she needed something to hold. "I knew a man who drove a delivery route out that way," she said. "Long time ago. Said there was some land back off the county road that wasn't on any current map. Said the county records office had it listed as unregistered land, some kind of dispute back in the day," he thought. Or maybe it was never properly filed. He wasn't sure. She paused. "That was maybe 12 years back. Might have changed since." "Unregistered," Dorothy said. "That's what he said. You know how some land out here is family passes it down, nobody files the paperwork, decades go by. Before you know it, it's like it doesn't exist on paper." She looked at Dorothy for a moment with the steady, non-intrusive assessment of someone who had seen enough of life to read a situation without needing to ask about it. "You doing okay, hon?" Dorothy looked at her coffee. "I'm trying to find out what my husband left me," she said. "And it turns out what he left me is a road that doesn't exist." Vera was quiet for another moment. "You want some eggs?" she said. "But I don't have—" Dorothy started, then stopped. She reached for her purse out of habit, already calculating. "It's on me," Vera said. "Don't argue." Dorothy looked up at her. There was something in Vera's face, not pity, nothing as condescending as pity, just a kind of solid, practical human recognition. "I see you. You're here. That's enough." "Thank you," Dorothy said. The eggs came scrambled with toast and a small cup of orange juice that was clearly from concentrate, but tasted exactly right. Dorothy ate slowly, looking at the address on the paper between bites. A place that didn't exist. A man who had spent 12 years building something and had said nothing about it. Not one word in 15 years of marriage, not one Sunday morning conversation, not one evening on the back porch with a cup of coffee between them. She thought about the things Walter had said in those last months, the long silences that had seemed like fatigue. The way he sometimes looked at her across a room with an expression she couldn't read, something between apology and satisfaction, like a man who had done something right and wasn't sure he would ever get to explain it. She thought she had understood those silences. She had attributed them to illness, to the slow accumulation of age, to the particular way men of Walter's generation carried things they couldn't put into words. She had been right about that last part. She just hadn't understood what he was carrying. Dorothy folded the paper, put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in her coat pocket. If it's truly nothing there, she thought, then I have nothing left to lose. And if it's something, if there's a reason a man who loved me would spend 12 years keeping a secret, then I have no choice but to go and find out what it is. She left enough money on the counter to cover a tip, even though Vera had said not to. Then she walked out into the November morning, got into her car, and typed Hardin County Rural Route 4 into her phone's GPS, not the full address because the full address didn't exist, but the general area of the nearest county road, the closest point she could navigate to before the map ran out. She drove. The highway gave way to two-lane state roads, and the state roads gave way to county routes. And the county routes narrowed and rough beneath her tires as Hardin County opened up around her flat, fields gone gray, with November tree lines along the creek beds, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with a single light in an upstairs window. The sky was still that pewter color, lower now pressing down like a lid. Her phone lost signal somewhere around the 40-minute mark. The GPS screen froze on a map that showed the road she was on ending in approximately half a mile, and then nothing. Just the pale blank of unmapped territory. She drove the half mile. The road did not end. It continued narrowing to gravel, the gravel growing thinner. And then she was on packed dirt with grass growing up the center in a strip that suggested the road was used but not often. Trees closed in from both sides. Branches brushed the roof of the car. Dorothy slowed to a crawl. She had pieced together the directions from the county road numbers and a gas station map she'd picked up at a station 15 miles back, an actual paper map, the kind they still printed for places that expected cell service to fail. She had marked possible routes with a pen. She had committed to one of them. Now following it, she was not at all certain she'd chosen correctly. The trees thickened. The light went pale and diffused beneath the canopy. And then without announcement, the path simply ended. Dorothy pressed the brakes. Ahead of her, a clearing, maybe 60 feet across. Dead grass, flat ground, a ring of trees at the edges, standing absolutely still in the windless cold. No house, no mailbox. No sign that anyone had ever intended anything for this piece of ground. She sat in the car for a long moment. Then she said out loud to no one, "Of course." It fit perfectly. It was the exact shape of everything else in the past 24 hours. She had been stripped of the house, the money, the car that wasn't quite hers, the rooms that had held 15 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days. And now the final thing, the one thing Walter had specifically set aside for her, turned out to be a clearing in the middle of Hardin County with nothing in it. She opened the car door and stepped out anyway. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, frozen and slightly soft in turns, the way Earth gets in November, when it can't decide whether winter has arrived. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it, not with grief, not even with disappointment exactly, with the particular quality of attention that comes when you have nothing left to protect. She looked at the ground, she looked at the tree line, she looked at the grass, and then she saw it. Not a structure, not a path in any dramatic sense, just a line barely visible, maybe 18 inches wide, where the grass was pressed differently from the rest. Bent at a slightly different angle, a shade or two darker the way ground gets when it's been walked on repeatedly over a long time and has learned the shape of that passage. Dorothy went still. She crossed the clearing slowly and crouched down near the line, reaching out to touch the grass with her fingertips. It bent easily, too easily for ground that hadn't been touched in years. The earth beneath it was compacted in a way that took time, not one person walking once, but many people walking many times over many seasons. She followed the line with her eyes. It curved slightly before disappearing into the trees. Not straight curved, as if whoever had made it was deliberately keeping what lay ahead hidden from anyone standing at this end. Dorothy stood up slowly. "Someone has been walking this," she said quietly. The words went nowhere. The clearing absorbed them. The trees held still. She looked back at her car. She looked at the path. She looked at her car again. Behind her was the highway and Kenton and the lawyer's conference table, and Prescott's careful voice reading out the terms of what remained of her life. Behind her was a parking lot at a supermarket and a blanket that smelled of the cedar chest it had been stored in for 3 winters. Behind her was a very clear picture of what the next chapter looked like, the shelter system, the conversations with Claire, the slow process of becoming a woman that people looked through rather than at. Ahead of her was a path that curved into the trees and disappeared. Dorothy tightened her coat against the cold. She thought about Walter's handwriting on that piece of paper, the blue ink, the slightly cramped left side, the way he had always written her name Dorothy when he was being serious, when he meant something, when he was leaving a message that wasn't casual. He'd used her full name on birthday cards, and on the note he left once, when he drove 3 hours to bring her soup because she had the flu and wouldn't let anyone come over. He had written Dorothy on that envelope. He had meant something. "All right, Walter," she said, not loudly, not the way people speak to the dead in movies full of passion and tears, just quietly the way you'd speak to someone sitting in the next room. "All right." She stepped onto the path. The grass pressed flat beneath her shoes. The tree line received her without ceremony. The clearing disappeared behind her faster than she expected, swallowed by the density of the branches, and within 30 steps, she could no longer see her car. The path was real. That was the first thing she was certain of. Someone had made this. Someone had walked it enough times to press it into the earth, to teach the grass to lie down in a particular direction, to give this corridor through the trees enough use that it retained the shape of human intention. Even in November, even without anyone walking it right now. She was not walking toward nothing. She didn't know what she was walking toward. She didn't know if it was something Walter had built, or something he had found, or something that would raise more questions than it answered. She didn't know if the end of this path would bring her any closer to understanding why a man she had been married to for 15 years had handed her a secret he'd kept for 12 of them. But she was walking towards something. And for Dorothy Harlan, standing in the cold November woods of Hardin County, Ohio, with one bag of clothes and a car that was technically not hers, and a coat that still fit after 11 years, that was enough. That was in fact everything. The trees opened without warning. One moment she was in the corridor of branches, the next she was standing at the edge of another space smaller than the clearing behind her, irregular in shape, carved by the trees rather than by any human hand. And in the center of it, set back against the far tree line, as if it had grown there rather than been built, a house. Small, weathered. The wood faded to the silver gray that happens when paint gives up, and the material underneath makes peace with the weather. The roof had a slight sag along the central ridge, not dangerous but honest the way old roofs get when they've held up too much for too long. A narrow porch across the front boards worn smooth. A window on either side of the door, both dark. Dorothy stood at the edge of the cleared space and looked at it. She had expected nothing, so this was more than nothing, which meant she had no way to calibrate her response. She stood there for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets, simply receiving the fact of the house. Then she walked toward it. The porch boards creaked under her weight, not alarmingly, just the comfortable protest of old wood acknowledging a presence. She stood at the door. She raised her hand and knocked, because that was what you did. The knock sounded small against the quiet of the woods. Nothing answered. She tried the handle. It turned. The door swung inward on hinges that moved with more ease than she'd expected, and she stepped inside. The smell reached her first. Wood, yes, and the particular dry coolness of an enclosed space. But underneath that, something else. Something lived in. Not the stale emptiness of abandonment, but the particular scent of a space that had been inhabited recently enough that the air still remembered it. Dorothy stood just inside the door and let her eyes adjust. A main room small, a table near the window to her left. A single chair angled slightly away from the table as if someone had stood up from it and hadn't come back. A mug on the table's edge, not overturned, not dramatically placed, just sitting there the way a mug sits when someone sets it down intending to return. Dorothy crossed to the table and looked at the mug without touching it. No dust on the rim. She looked at the table's surface. Dust elsewhere along the back edge and the corners on the windowsill. But the table itself, the area immediately around the mug, wiped recently. A week, maybe less. She moved to the small kitchen area. A sink. She turned the handle. Water came out, not a leak, not a sputter. Clean water flowing steadily from a faucet connected to something that was working. She turned it off and stood there listening to the silence that followed. "No one's been here," she said to the room. The room didn't correct her, but she corrected herself. Someone had been here. Someone had wiped this table and left this mug and turned on this water supply. And then what left? Or simply moved to another part of the house. Dorothy turned and looked at the wall to her right. It was wood-paneled like the rest of the room, the same faded gray. Nothing remarkable about it at first glance. But the light from the window hit it at an angle that caught something, a slight difference in the surface, a section where the grain ran just marginally differently, where the seam between boards was just barely less weathered than the boards around it. She walked to it slowly. She put her palm flat against it. Warm. Not sun-warmed, the window was across the room. Not air-warmed, the rest of the room was cool. Something behind this wall was generating heat. Something on the other side was alive, in the way that spaces are alive when people are in them, when breath and body and the accumulated warmth of occupation changes the temperature of the materials around it. Dorothy spread her fingers against the wood. She pressed. Nothing. She moved her hand along the seam, searching. Pressed again, lower this time, near what would be the floor if this were a door. A sound, quiet, controlled, like something releasing from a catch it had been holding for a long time. The panel moved. It swung inward, not dramatically, not with any special theatrical effect, just opened the way a well-made thing opens when you find the right place to push. Behind it, darkness. Not empty darkness, structured darkness with depth to it, with the faint geometry of a space that had been built rather than simply excavated. And warmth, definite warmth rising from below. And a smell, not decay, not earth, but something human. The smell of people living, of breath and wool, and the particular warmth of occupied space. And from somewhere below, faint but unmistakable, a sound. Footsteps. Dorothy stood at the edge of the opening, with her heart moving fast and her breath visible in the cold air of the room behind her, and the warm air of whatever was below rising against her face, and she understood in that moment with complete and sudden clarity that she had not arrived at the end of something. She had arrived at the beginning. "Walter," she whispered. Her voice came out steady. "What did you build?" From below, the footsteps grew closer. The footsteps were measured, unhurried. The sound of someone who had heard her moving above and had decided after some internal calculation that approaching was the right response. Dorothy did not step back from the opening. She had come too far, not just the 3 hours of driving, not just the path through the November woods, but too far in the larger sense, through too many years of standing at the edges of rooms that didn't quite belong to her, to step back now from a door that she had found herself. She stood her ground and waited. The figure that emerged from the darkness was old. Older than she'd expected, though she hadn't known what to expect. A man in his late 70s, broad-shouldered, even with the slight forward curve that age puts into tall men, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and a faded green plaid. His face was deeply lined, the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and had stopped apologizing for it. His hair was white and close-cropped. His eyes were dark and steady, and were currently examining Dorothy with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to make quick assumptions about strangers. He stopped at the top of what she now understood was a staircase, narrow, built into the floor, leading down into whatever space lay below. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was low and careful, each word placed deliberately. "My husband left me this address," Dorothy said. Something moved across the man's face. Not surprise. Recognition. The specific kind of recognition that comes when something you have been told to expect has finally arrived. "What's his name?" he said. "Walter Harlan." The silence that followed was brief but complete. The man looked at her for a moment longer, and then he turned his head back toward the stairs and said something Dorothy couldn't make out. Quiet words directed downward, the tone of a man letting others know that whatever they'd been bracing for had arrived and could be stood down. Then he looked back at her and stepped aside. "Come down," he said. The staircase was narrow but solid, 12 steps, each one built with the care of someone who understood that the people using them would not always be young. A rope handrail on one side nodded at intervals for grip. Dorothy descended slowly, one hand on the rope, and with each step the warmth increased, and the smell of inhabited space grew stronger, and the darkness gave way to light, soft amber, the kind that comes from lanterns rather than fixtures. She stepped off the last stair and stood still. The space was larger than the house above it, considerably larger. The ceiling was low, perhaps 6.5 feet, but reinforced with beams set at regular intervals, each one solid and true. The walls were framed and insulated. The floor was packed earth covered with plywood, and on the plywood rugs mismatched but arranged with care, overlapping at the edges, covering most of the surface. Along one wall, shelving, deep, well-built shelving, stocked with canned goods in careful rows, vegetables, beans, soups, fruit. Below the shelving, water containers, the large rectangular kind stacked too high. A camp stove, clean and maintained. A row of lanterns, some lit, some waiting. Along another wall, beds, 4 of them simple frames with good mattresses and folded blankets at the foot of each. The beds were made not the tight military corner precision of performance, but the everyday neatness of people who made their beds, because it was the first orderly act of a day that might not offer many others. Near one bed, a pair of worn leather shoes set parallel to each other with a deliberateness that spoke of habit of ritual, of someone who had learned that small orders matter when larger ones are unavailable. Near another, a book left face down on the blanket, the reader interrupted mid-chapter expecting to return. Dorothy took all of this in slowly, not cataloging, just receiving. The man from the stairs stood a few feet away watching her, and now she saw the others. A woman approximately the same age as the man seated on a wooden chair near the far wall with a cup of something warm between her palms. She had white hair cut practically short and the kind of face that had once been beautiful in a way that aging had refined rather than erased. She was watching Dorothy with an expression that was cautious but not unfriendly, the look of someone who had been through enough to know that most arrivals were worth hearing out. Beside the shelving, half turned away, a younger woman, perhaps 60, heavy set with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the posture of someone who had been a teacher, that particular uprightness, the habit of a body accustomed to being the authority in a room. She didn't speak. She watched. And near the staircase, standing the way men stand when they want to be ready to move but are trying not to appear ready to move another man. Perhaps 65, wiry, with a close-trimmed white beard and the specific calloused hands of someone who had worked with machinery for decades. 4 people, 4 beds. A space built for exactly this number, maintained with the quiet discipline of people who understood that what they had here was not guaranteed and could not be taken for granted. The tall man with the white hair spoke. "My name is Earl Dawson," he said. "This is my wife, Ruth." The seated woman gave a small nod. "Patricia Oakes," the woman with the reading glasses. "And James Whitfield." The man near the stairs. Dorothy nodded to each of them in turn. "How long have you been here?" she asked. It was Earl who answered. "Ruth and I 12 years this past spring, Patricia 4 years, James 2.5. 12 years, the same length of time as the address Walter had written down. The same year as the purchase date on whatever document had created this place, a date Dorothy didn't know yet, but was beginning to understand. "He built this," she said. "Not quite a question." "He started it," Earl said. "We helped as we were able. He had the design, the materials. He knew what he wanted it to be." Dorothy looked around again. The shelving, the beds, the careful, unglamorous functionality of everything. Nothing here was decorative, nothing here was meant to impress, but everything was well made, chosen for durability rather than appearance, arranged for use by people who needed things to actually work. "He never told me," she said. The words landed simply. She wasn't accusing anyone. She was simply stating a fact that was still settling into its full shape its await her. Ruth, the seated woman, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft and precise, the voice of a woman who had learned to make her words count. "He talked about you," she said. "Not often, but when he did, it was the way people talk about things they're trying to protect." Dorothy looked at her. "Protect from what?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "From having to choose," she said. Dorothy understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to. Walter had always done that, held things at a careful distance from each other, kept the parts of his life in separate rooms, not out of deception, but out of a particular kind of love that expressed itself through protection rather than disclosure. She had known this about him. She had sometimes found it maddening. She had also, if she was honest, found it one of the most steadying things about being married to him. He had thought about consequences before he acted. He had prepared for things quietly. He had loved her in a way that looked from certain angles like absence. She pulled the wooden chair from beside the table, the only remaining chair she noted, and sat down. "Tell me what this is," she said. Earl told it simply without embellishment, the way men of his generation tell stories they've lived, not performing the emotion but letting the facts carry it. Walter had bought the land in 2012 under Dorothy's name. Earl had been the first person to arrive, a former carpenter who had lost his house and savings after a fall from a scaffold at a job site, had ended his working life, and begun a medical debt that the insurance company had found 17 ways to avoid covering. He had met Walter through a church that no longer existed in a building that was now a parking structure. Walter had driven him out here in the spring of 2012, shown him the land, shown him the plans he'd sketched on graph paper, and said, "I need someone who knows how to build. I'll provide the materials. You tell me if the design is sound." It had taken them 18 months working weekends. Dorothy had known Walter was doing something on weekends. He had told her he was helping a friend with a property. He had not been lying, Earl said. He had simply not been complete. The first person to use the space other than Earl and Ruth, who had moved in permanently by late 2013, was a woman in her late 40s whose name Earl didn't share. She'd stayed 4 months, left with enough stability to begin again. Walter had asked for nothing in return, no paperwork, no payment, no accounting for where she went afterward. He said, Earl continued, that the only requirement was that you leave when you were ready and you didn't tell anyone about the address. And people found it how? Word, careful word, person to person only when Walter was certain. Earl paused. He was always certain about the person. He was never uncertain about anyone he brought here in 12 years. Dorothy was quiet, thinking about a man she had shared a bed with for 15 years, who had carried all of this without visible effort, who had driven out here on weekends and built something with his hands in the Ohio woods and said nothing about it except that he was helping a friend. She thought about the things you know about a person and the things you don't know, and how both can be true simultaneously, and how the things you don't know don't necessarily mean the things you thought you knew were wrong. She had known Walter was kind. She had simply not understood the full dimensions of that kindness. Why the secrecy? She asked. Why erase the road from the county records? Earl and Ruth exchanged a glance, brief, practiced, the silent communication of people who have been married long enough to have entire conversations in a look. It was Ruth who answered. Because places like this don't survive if they're known, she said. They get purchased, developed, or they become official, which sounds good, until official means inspectors and regulations and liability, and the people they're meant for can't actually use them. He had the road removed from the county records in 2013, Earl said. He knew a man who handled property filings. It cost him something. He didn't tell me how much. Dorothy thought about the savings account, $218,000 divided among the 4 children. She wondered what it had looked like before 12 years of quiet, systematic expenditure, weekends of materials, the cost of erasing an address, the ongoing supply of a space like this one. She wondered how much of a life a person could spend on something no one knew about. She was beginning to understand that the answer was all of it. She didn't hear the engine at first because the walls were well insulated, which was the point of them. It was James who heard it. He'd been near the base of the stairs, and he went still in the particular way that people go still when they're processing a sound they weren't expecting and don't want to be wrong about. Vehicle, he said quietly. Everyone in the room stopped. Dorothy looked at Earl. Earl's expression had changed, not panic, but the rapid, disciplined shift of someone moving from ordinary time into a different kind of time. How far out? Ruth asked James. Road edge, James said. Stopped. A door, faint through the insulation but present the solid thunk of a car door closing. Then another. Earl looked at Dorothy. Were you followed? I don't know, she said honestly. I didn't see anyone. You wouldn't, Earl said. Not accusatory, just factual. She thought about the parking lot at Hembry and Associates, the way Prescott had shifted in his chair when Hembry mentioned the envelope, the slight movement, that fractional adjustment that she had noticed and filed away and had not until this moment fully interpreted. Prescott, she said, Walter's son. He was at the lawyer's office this morning. He saw the envelope. Earl nodded slowly. He turned to Ruth and said 2 quiet words. Ruth stood, moved to the far end of the space, and began doing something near the shelving that Dorothy couldn't fully see. Methodical practice, the way people move through a task they have rehearsed. Earl turned back to Dorothy. We don't panic, he said. We've thought about this moment. What do? We wait, and we listen, and we let whoever is up there take the first move. He looked at her steadily. If it's just the son looking for an inheritance, we have time. If it's something else, he paused. Then we'll know quickly enough. Above them, footsteps on the porch. Dorothy sat very still. The footsteps were confident, not the hesitant shuffle of someone unsure of where they were, but the measured pace of someone who had arrived at a destination and was approaching it with the expectation of access. Then a second set, lighter, quicker. The door opened above them. Dorothy heard footsteps cross the floor of the room overhead. She could trace their path by the faint creaking. The same creaking she had made herself 20 minutes ago. Whoever it was moved with familiarity, not the tentative exploration of someone seeing a space for the first time. They had been here before, or they had been told in enough detail that they could move through the space as if they had. The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, Dorothy realized she was holding her breath. She released it slowly, quietly. Then a voice, smooth, unhurried, with the particular confidence of someone who had never in his professional life needed to raise it to be heard. "Well," the voice said, "this is more impressive than I expected." He came down the stairs as if he owned them. That was the first thing Dorothy registered. Not the suit, not the briefcase, not the younger man who followed 2 steps behind and stationed himself at the base of the stairs like punctuation. The first thing was the quality of his descent, unhurried, deliberate, one hand lightly on the rope handrail, as if he were simply familiarizing himself with a property he was considering. He was perhaps 52, 53, well built in the way of men who exercise for maintenance rather than vanity. Dark hair going silver at the temples, a face that was not unkind. That was the thing about him, the thing Dorothy registered immediately and filed carefully. He did not look like a villain. He looked like a man who had learned over many years of getting what he wanted that the most effective tool available to him was the appearance of reasonableness. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stood in the space looking around with the same slow receiving attention Dorothy had used when she'd first arrived, but to different purpose. Where Dorothy had been taking inventory of what people had made here, this man was taking inventory of what it was worth. His eyes moved from the shelving, to the beds, to the structural beams, to the floor space, to the ceiling height. Professional, thorough, quick. Then his eyes moved to Dorothy. "Mrs. Harlan," he said. The recognition was immediate and unsurprising. "I'm Clive Morrow." He said it the way people say their name when they expect it to mean something. Dorothy looked at him steadily. "I don't know that name," she said. Something shifted in his expression so briefly that she almost missed it. A small recalibration. He had expected her to know his name, and her not knowing it had momentarily disrupted his arrangement of this scene. He recovered immediately. "I'm a developer," he said. "Property acquisition, primarily rural. I've had an interest in this land for some time." He looked around the space again unhurriedly. "Your husband and I spoke 3 years ago." "He didn't mention it," Dorothy said. "No," Morrow said. "I don't imagine he did." There was no bitterness in it, just a calm acknowledgement of a fact. "He was a difficult man to move your husband." I respected that, actually. Men who know what they have and hold on to it, I've always found that admirable, even when it inconvenient. Earl was standing near the shelving, arms loose at his sides. Ruth was seated again. Patricia and James had gone quiet in the particular way of people who have learned that the best thing you can do in a room where power is being negotiated is make yourself unremarkable. Morrow looked at Earl briefly the way a man looks at furniture, acknowledging its presence without giving it particular weight. Then he looked back at Dorothy. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, and reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document. He set it on the table, the same table where the mug sat, the mug that had no dust on its rim. "This is a purchase agreement. The land, 12.4 acres, which is what this parcel amounts to, at $340,000, above market for unregistered land in Hardin County." He paused. "Significantly above market." Dorothy looked at the document. She did not touch it. "I should also be straightforward about the other part of this." Morrow continued, his voice remaining exactly what it had been measured, reasonable, devoid of threat in its tone, while being entirely composed of it in its substance. "I've spoken with the county assessor's office. This land's status, unregistered, with the history it has of being deliberately removed from county records, creates a particular kind of legal vulnerability. Without clear title documentation filed with the county, the land is subject to adverse possession, claims to eminent domain consideration, to any number of actions that don't require your cooperation." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not here to threaten. I'm telling you the situation clearly because I'd prefer a clean transaction." "You'd prefer," Dorothy said. "I would," he said. "It's simpler for everyone." Dorothy looked at the document again. $340,000. She thought about the parking lot at Patsy's Diner. She thought about the blanket in her back seat. She thought about the way Vera had said, "You doing okay, Han?" with that particular quality of human recognition, And she thought about what it meant to have someone see you when you were at the bottom of what your life had become. She thought about signing. She thought about what would happen to Earl and Ruth if she signed. To Patricia and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. To James with his calloused machinery hands. "I'd like 48 hours," she said. Morrow looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once with the air of a man who could afford to be generous with 48 hours, because he was certain the answer would be the same after them as it would be now. "Of course," he said. He picked up the document, replaced it in his pocket. "I'll come back day after tomorrow. We can finalize then." He looked around the space one more time, not longingly, not regretfully, with the precise impersonal assessment of a man who was already imagining it as something else. "This is good construction," he said, and his voice carried what sounded almost like sincerity. "Whoever built it knew what they were doing." He went up the stairs. The younger man followed. Dorothy listened to their footsteps cross the floor above the door, the porch boards, the silence. Then from outside, two car doors. An engine. Gone. The electricity went out that night. Not gradually. One moment the small lamp in the corner was on, and then it wasn't. The darkness arrived complete and immediate, and in the 2 seconds before Earl had a lantern lit, Dorothy sat in total blackness and heard the breathing of four other people and understood in that pure dark what it meant to be completely dependent on the practical knowledge of people who had been here longer than she had. The lantern bloomed. Earl set it on the table without comment. "He said 48 hours, Patricia said. "He lied." James said, not angrily, just accurately. Earl looked at Dorothy. "The power line comes off the county road. It's not complicated to interrupt. He's done this before, not here, but the technique is known." He paused. "Water will be next. By morning, probably." Dorothy sat with her hands on the table. $340,000. The space she was in, the people around her, the mug with no dust on the rim. She thought about the 48 hours. She thought about what would happen at the end of them. She thought about the document in Morrow's pocket and the way he had described the land's legal vulnerability. And she thought about how precise he had been, how fluent in the language of legal mechanism, the way a man is fluent in a language when he has used it many times to accomplish exactly what he wanted. She thought about the Honya No, the marriage contract. The thing Prescott's lawyer had mentioned in passing at the Hembry meeting in a subordinate clause that Dorothy had heard but not fully processed in the moment, subject to the terms of the premarital agreement filed in the state of Nevada. She and Walter had married in Nevada. There had been a document she remembered signing. It remembered Walter explaining it with the slightly apologetic patience of a man who knew it was a formality but felt the need to make it feel like less of one. She had not read it carefully. She had trusted Walter. She had been 52 years old and had trusted a man she loved and had signed a document in a Nevada notary office on a Thursday afternoon in October 2009. She did not know what that document said in full, and Prescott did. He arrived the next morning while the light was still thin with a lawyer. Dorothy had never seen a compact, precise woman named Cheryl, something who carried two manila folders, and the expression of someone who had come prepared to deliver information rather than negotiate. Dorothy met them in the house above because the cold had gotten into her joints during the night, and she needed to stand in what passed for warmth before she could think clearly. Prescott looked around the small main room with an expression that tried to be neutral and landed somewhere near distaste. He had never been good. Dorothy had always thought at hiding the things he felt were beneath him. "The premarital agreement you signed in Nevada in 2009, Cheryl said without preamble, opening the first folder, contains a standard property exclusion clause. All assets acquired individually prior to marriage remain separate property." She turned a page. "However, it also contains an extended provision, not uncommon in agreements of this type, that applies a 2-year look-back period to any assets acquired in the early period of the marriage and subsequently titled solely in one party's name." She looked up at Dorothy. "This land was purchased in 2012, she continued, 3 years after the marriage. Under the look-back provision, if the titled party, in this case you, Mrs. Harlan, cannot demonstrate independent financial contribution to the purchase, the asset may be reclassified as marital property, subject to distribution per the terms of the estate." Dorothy listened to this carefully. She had spent a career as a high school office administrator, which meant she had spent decades listening to the precise language of bureaucratic procedure and learning to hear not just what it said, but what it was intended to accomplish. What this language was intended to accomplish was to make her doubt. Not to win a legal argument she didn't know enough yet to know whether the argument was even valid, but to make her stand in this cold, small room with one bag of clothes in a car she might not be able to keep and doubt whether she had any ground at all to stand on. Prescott watched her. His expression had changed slightly. There was something eager in it now, just barely the kind of eagerness that only appears when someone believes they are close to something. "She'd like to respond," he said, as if Dorothy needed him to speak on her behalf. Dorothy looked at him. "I'll respond when I'm ready," she said. He blinked. She looked at Cheryl. "I'd like a copy of the agreement." Cheryl hesitated just briefly. The hesitation of someone who hadn't expected this to be the first request and then produced a copy from the second folder. She held it out. Dorothy took it. "Thank you," Dorothy said. "I'll be in touch." Prescott opened his mouth, closed it. They left. That night was the worst one. The water had gone as Earl had predicted. Sometime that afternoon, the pipe that ran from the well to the house above had been interrupted at the junction box near the road. Earl had anticipated this and had already moved the stored water containers into more accessible positions. They had what they needed for several days if they were careful. But careful was its own kind of wait. Dorothy sat in the car. She had gone up to sit in it because the lantern light in the space below made everything feel enclosed, and she needed the thin, cold dark of outside and the ability to see the sky, or at least the blackness where the sky was. The purchase agreement was on her lap. Clive Morrow's document, which she'd asked Earl to retrieve from the table where Morrow had left it the first time she had gone back, and found that he'd left a second copy tucked under the mug she'd noticed on the first day, as if he'd known she would be back and wanted to make the signing as convenient as possible. $340,000. She had done the arithmetic. The shelter system, months of waiting lists, shared rooms, the quiet erosion of privacy and agency that begins the moment you are required to explain yourself to receive basic things. Even if she found a job at 64 with a skill set built around administrative systems that had changed substantially in the last decade, the timeline from here to any kind of stability was long and uncertain. $340,000 would end that uncertainty immediately. She could call Claire in Portland. She could explain. Claire would understand Claire was reasonable and loving and would never blame Dorothy for taking money when money was what she had been left without. She could close this chapter, whatever it was, and begin again somewhere with enough of a foundation to build on. Dorothy looked at the document. She looked at the pen in her hand. She had found it in the glove compartment, a black ballpoint, slightly dried out but functional, the kind of pen that accumulates in glove compartments without anyone putting it there deliberately. She clicked it. The small mechanical sound was very loud in the silence. She looked at the signature line at the bottom of the document. Dorothy Harlan, printed beneath a blank line, waiting. She thought about Prescott's eager expression. She thought about Morrow's unhurried reasonableness. She thought about the way both of them had in different registers offered her a version of this same thing, a way out. A clean ending, a number with enough zeros that all the other numbers stopped mattering. She thought about the mug on the table, the shoes placed parallel, the book left face down mid-chapter. She thought about Walter's handwriting. Dorothy, blue ink slightly cramped on the left. She looked at the pen. She looked at the signature line. And then she looked at the darkness beyond the windshield, and past the darkness, she thought about the space below, and somewhere in the texture of what she remembered from her first walk through it, the rugs laid with care, the shelving stocked with patience, the beams set true over 12 years of quiet weekends, she thought about something specific. The name carved into the wood. Not her full name, just DH initials cut small and careful into the underside of a support beam in the far corner, the kind of place you would only find if you were looking or if you happened to be examining the structure with the attention of someone who builds things and cares about whether they will last. D.H. Walter had not been careless with initials. He had not been careless with anything. If he had put those letters in that beam, he had put them there for a reason, the same way he had put her name on a piece of paper in an envelope that he specified should go to no one else. Dorothy put the cap back on the pen. She did not sign. She sat in the car for another hour, letting the not signing settle into something steadier than decision. Then she got out, walked through the cold to the house, went down the stairs, and found Earl sitting in the lantern light, reading from a small paperback that he set down when she appeared. She sat in the chair across from him. "Earl," she said, "did Walter ever say anything to you about me, specifically?" "Not in general." Earl was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is not uncertain about the answer, but is deciding how much of it to give. Then he stood, went to the far end of the space, and crouched near the base of the shelving. He moved two water containers. Beneath them, a board in the floor loose, fitted carefully but not fastened. He lifted it. Inside a box, metal the color of old pewter, the size of a shoebox, sealed with a simple clasp. He carried it to the table and set it in front of Dorothy. "He told me in 2012, Earl said, sitting back down. "He said if a woman named Dorothy comes here, if she comes, and she asks about this place, and she asks about me, you give her this." He looked at the box, then at Dorothy. He said, "Don't give it to her when she arrives. Give it to her when she asks." He said she'd need to find the question herself before the answer would mean anything. Dorothy looked at the box. She thought about Walter, a man who had understood better than she had given him credit for the difference between being given a thing and arriving at it. She put her hands on the clasp. Outside, somewhere on the county road, a car passed slowly. Its headlights swept briefly across the small window near the ceiling of the space, the only window ground level outside, set high in the wall like a basement transom. The lights moved on. Dorothy opened the box. The box contained three things. A folded document on paper that had the particular weight and texture of something prepared by a professional, thick stock, slightly cream-colored, with a notary seal pressed into the lower left corner. A small envelope sealed with her name written on the front in Walter's blue ink, and a brass key on a simple ring, the kind that opens a lockbox or a filing cabinet, old enough that the teeth had the slight softness of a key that had been cut before digital precision made all keys identical. Dorothy looked at the three things for a long moment without touching them. Then she picked up the document. It was a deed, a property deed recorded with the Hardin County Recorder's Office on April 14th, 2012, bearing the official stamp of the county and the signature of the recorder on duty that day, and the notary seal she had already noticed. The legal description of the land ran for 2 full paragraphs in the dense, specific language of property law, meets and bounds, compass, bearings, reference to adjacent parcels, the particular vocabulary that turns a piece of earth into something legible to systems of ownership. At the top of the document, in the space designated for the name of the grantee, the person to whom the land was being transferred, the person who would own it from that day forward, was her name, Dorothy Ann Harlan. Not Walter's name, not a joint tenancy, not Walter and Dorothy Harlan or the Harlan Family Trust, or any of the forms in which two people sometimes hold a thing together. Just her name, alone, complete. Dorothy sat with the document in her hands for a long time without speaking. The lantern on the table cast its amber light across the paper, and across her hands, and across the grain of the wood, and across the face of Earl Dawson, who was watching her with the patience of a man who had waited 12 years for this moment, and had learned in those 12 years that patience was not passive. "He put it in my name," she said finally. "From the beginning," Earl said. "He never told me." "No," Earl said. "He said you wouldn't have accepted it if he'd asked." Dorothy considered this. She thought about what it meant to know someone, to know the architecture of how they received things, what they could take as a gift, and what they needed to arrive at on their own. Walter had understood something about her that she hadn't fully understood about herself, that she would have said no. Not out of pride exactly, out of the particular reluctance of a woman who had spent a lifetime being careful about what she allowed herself to need from other people. He had known she would say no, so he hadn't asked. He had simply done it and put the evidence in a metal box under a board in the floor of a place she would only find if she followed a piece of paper he'd left in a sealed envelope to an address that didn't exist on any map. He had built the entire structure of it, the secrecy, the address, the 12 years of silence, not to hide something from her, but to make certain that when she found it, she would find it on her own terms. "You didn't give it to her when she arrived," he had told Earl. "You gave it to her when she asked." She'd needed to find the question herself before the answer would mean anything. Dorothy set the deed on the table carefully, the way you set something down when you understand that it is no longer just paper. She picked up the small, sealed envelope. She opened it. Inside was a single index card. Walter's handwriting, blue ink, the slightly cramped left side. 8 words. "It was always yours. I just kept it safe." Dorothy read the 8 words twice. Then she folded the index card and held it in her closed hand and sat very still while something moved through her that was not grief and not relief and not anger at the years of silence, but something that contained all three of those things and was larger than any of them individually. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name because it has never needed one. It has only ever needed to be felt. Earl said nothing. Ruth, from her bed where she had been lying quietly in the lantern dark, said nothing. The space held its breath. After a while, Dorothy put the index card in her coat pocket next to the original envelope, next to the address that didn't exist. She looked at Earl. "I need a lawyer," she said. The name came from Ruth, not Earl. Ruth had a memory for names and circumstances, the way some people have a memory for music, not something she cultivated, just something she carried. She lay on her side in the lantern light and said the name in a quiet, certain voice, as if she'd been holding it ready. "Lenora Vance," Ruth said. "She practices in Kenton, property law, land title disputes. She came here in 2015. A pause. "She was here for 4 months. Dorothy looked at her. "She stayed here. She had nowhere else," Ruth said simply. "Her firm dissolved in a partnership dispute. Her husband left the same month. She lost the house in the settlement." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Walter brought her out one evening in February. She stayed through June. Then she got back on her feet and left." Another pause. "She never told anyone where she'd been. That was the agreement. But she left Walter her card and said, 'If you ever need someone who knows property law in Hardin County and will fight for a lost cause, call me.'" "Did Walter ever call her?" Dorothy asked. "Not that I know of," Ruth said, "but he kept the card." Where Ruth looked at Earl. Earl reached into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and produced a business card worn at the corners that had clearly been there for some time. He held it out. Dorothy took it. "Lenora Vance, attorney at law, property and land title disputes, Hardin County, Ohio, a phone number, a Kenton address." Dorothy held the card in the lantern light and looked at it for a moment, thinking about a man who kept things in order that other people might need them, who built spaces and recorded deeds and left cards in shirt pockets and wrote 8 words on an index card and put them in a metal box under a board in a floor. She thought about how much of a life you could spend preparing for what comes after it. She put the card in her pocket. In the morning, she said, she drove into Kenton before 7 when the morning was still half dark and the coffee shops were just turning their signs. She found Lenora Vance's office on a side street off Main, a small building that had once been a house with a sign beside the front door that was modest to the point of near invisibility. The kind of sign that said, "I am not trying to impress you. I am trying to do the work." She sat in her car until the lights came on ISO at 7:45. Then she went to the door. The woman who answered was 58, perhaps 59. Medium height, dark hair gone heavily silver, cut to the jaw. She wore reading glasses on a chain and carried a coffee mug with the handle repaired with what appeared to be electrical tape. She had the face of someone who had been through something substantial and had come out the other side of it not softer but more precise, the way certain materials become when they are worked hard and held to heat. She looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at her. "My name is Dorothy Harlan," Dorothy said. "I have a property deed that needs to be validated and a purchase agreement I need to fight. I was told you might be willing to help." Lenora Vance looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Dorothy could not fully read, something between recognition and a very old, very quiet kind of gratitude, as if she were seeing something she had spent years expecting to see. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. She did not ask how Dorothy had gotten her name. Dorothy did not offer it. Some information passes between people in the complete form of itself, needing no explanation, because both parties already understand the shape of the context that made it possible. They sat across from each other at a small mumble in the office that had once been a living room, and Dorothy laid out the deed and the premarital agreement and Morrow's purchase contract and the copy of the county records Cheryl had provided, and Lenora put on her reading glasses and read everything with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman who had learned, probably through at least one significant professional catastrophe, not to skip anything. She read for 22 minutes without speaking. Then she set her glasses on the chain and looked at Dorothy. The premarital agreement clause that Prescott Harlan's lawyer cited, she said, applies to assets acquired within 2 years of the marriage and titled solely in one party's name without demonstrable independent contribution. She set her hand flat on the deed. This land was purchased 3 years after your marriage. The 2-year look-back period doesn't apply. She paused. Additionally, the land is titled solely in your name, not in your husband's name. The clause covers assets titled in one party's name. It was written to protect him, not you. Even if the timeline were arguable, the structure of the deed defeats the claim. Prescott knew this, Dorothy said. Almost certainly, Lenore said. Not with outrage, just with the matter-of-fact recognition of someone who had seen this precise maneuver before. It's a pressure tactic. The law is complicated enough that most people, when they hear a legal-sounding explanation delivered with confidence, assume it's correct. She looked at Dorothy steadily. You didn't sign anything? No. Good. She looked at the purchase agreement. Morrow's County vulnerability argument is more substantive, but also more manageable. The land being removed from county records creates a title cloud, but you have the recorded deed which supersedes the administrative removal. We file a quiet title action with the county recorder's office to reestablish the public record. Once that's filed, his adverse possession argument collapses. She paused. He'll escalate. He already cut the power and water. Lenore looked at her for a moment. When did that happen? Day before yesterday, night then morning. Lenore picked up a notepad and began writing. That's utility interference on land held under valid deed. It's actionable. She wrote for a moment longer. He'll know we're moving when we file the quiet title action. He'll go to the county, possibly try the eminent domain angle. It's been done before to pressure small landholders. It's slow and usually fails, but it creates enough uncertainty to make people settle. She set down the pen. Are you prepared for this to take time? Dorothy thought about the blanket in her back seat. She thought about Vera at the diner setting a coffee mug down in front of her without being asked. She thought about 8 words on an index card held now in her coat pocket, next to the first envelope, and the address that didn't exist on any map. I'm not in a hurry, she said. I don't have anywhere else to be. Lenora looked at her for a moment with that same expression Dorothy had seen at the door, that quality of recognition she couldn't quite name. I'll file the quiet title action today, Lenora said, and I'll send a letter to Morrow's office documenting the utility interference. That won't stop him, but it creates a record. She began organizing the documents. There's one more thing you should know. There's a county board of supervisors meeting scheduled for next week's regular session. If Morrow moves quickly on the eminent domain angle, he could request a placement on the agenda. If that happens, you'd need to appear and present your case to the board directly. Would you be there? Lenore was quiet for a moment. I would normally represent you, she said. But there are procedural rules that restrict attorney participation in certain preliminary board hearings, specifically when the matter hasn't yet been formally accepted onto the eminent domain docket. In that situation, the property holder needs to present themselves. She paused. I can prepare you, but you'd need to stand up there on your own. Dorothy looked at her. All right, she said. Morrow moved quickly. She had expected he would. The quiet title action was filed on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Morrow's attorney had responded with a motion challenging the validity of the 2013 administrative record removal and requesting a temporary injunction against any further filing related to the property. By Saturday morning, a private security vehicle, a large black SUV with a company name on the door that Dorothy didn't recognize, was parked at the entrance to the county road nearest to Hollow Creek. It didn't block the road. It just sat there, engine running visible. He's marking the territory, Earl said when Dorothy described it, making sure we know he's watching. I know, Dorothy said. She had been sleeping in the space below most nights now, not in one of the 4 beds, which she had refused, but on a folding cot that James had produced from somewhere in the supply area with the quiet resourcefulness of a man who had spent his working life solving mechanical problems with available materials. She ate with them in the evenings, simple meals on the camp stove, the kind of food that required no performance. Canned soup and crackers and dried fruit and strong coffee that Earl made in a battered percolator that he treated with the respect most people reserve for precision instruments. She learned their rhythms. The way Earl rose first before 6 and sat with his coffee in a specific silence that was not unfriendly but was not to be interrupted. The way Ruth read in the evenings with the focused absorption of someone for whom books had always been and remained the most reliable form of other worlds. Patricia's habit of organizing the supply shelving at the end of each day, checking dates and rotating stock, with the methodical attention of someone who had once been responsible for 30 children at a time and had never fully retired the habit of accounting for resources. James's quietness, which was not depression, but self-containment, the particular interiority of a man who had spent decades in the sustained noise of industrial work and had come to love silence the way people love things they've had to wait a long time for. She learned them, and in learning them, she began to understand what Walter had understood, that this place worked not because of its physical structure, but because of the quality of attention the people in it gave to each other, the small courtesies, the unspoken agreements about space and sound and privacy, the way four people in a low-ceilinged space could live together without friction, not because conflict never arose, but because they had all separately and for different reasons arrived at the understanding that other people's difficulty was not a burden, but a condition of being alive among other people. Walter had built the structure, but the people had built this. On the Monday of the board meeting week, Prescott called her cell phone. She had signal in the car on the county road. She answered because she had decided sometime in the previous few days to stop treating avoidance as a strategy. "Dorothy," he said. His voice was carefully modulated. "I want to talk about the situation." "All right," she said. "The legal proceedings are going to be expensive for everyone, drawn out. I think there's a version of this that works for both of us." A pause. "Morrow has indicated he'd go to 380 if you cooperated with a clean title transfer offer. I could facilitate that. There would be something for you from that transaction. A finder's arrangement." Another pause, slightly longer. $40,000, Dorothy. Clear, direct. No complications." Dorothy looked out the windshield at the security vehicle parked at the county road entrance. Its engine was running. Small wisps of exhaust rose into the cold air. "You've been talking to Morrow," she said. "We've been in touch, yes. Since before the funeral." The pause this time was different, shorter, tighter. "That's not relevant to—" "It is relevant," Dorothy said. "You contacted Morrow before your father was in the ground, Prescott. I want to know if I'm wrong about that." Silence. She was not wrong. "I'm not taking Morrow's money," she said, "and I'm not taking yours. And I'd like you to ask yourself, not for my benefit, for yours, whether you understand what your father built out here and why he built it. Not the structure, the reason." She paused. "Because I didn't understand it until 3 days ago, and I was married to him for 15 years. So I don't blame you for not understanding it, but I think you should try." She ended the call. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she started the engine and drove back down toward the house. The County Board of Supervisors met on Thursday evening in a building in Kenton that had once been a school gymnasium and had been divided at some point in the intervening decades into meeting rooms and offices with the kind of pragmatic repurposing that small county governments do when they have practical needs and limited budgets. The main meeting room held perhaps 40 seats, and on the Thursday evening in question, perhaps 30 of them were occupied. Dorothy arrived 15 minutes early. She sat in the second row. Lenora had spent 2 evenings preparing her, not coaching her on what to say. Lenora had been precise about this distinction. She had helped Dorothy understand the procedural context, who the 5 board members were, what their inclinations tended to be on land use questions, what the formal structure of the hearing would look like, what she was permitted to address, and what fell outside her standing to raise. She had given Dorothy a copy of the quiet title filing and the deed and a 1-page summary of the legal position. And then she had said, "The law is on your side, but law alone doesn't always win in a room like this. What wins is clarity. People who know what they're talking about and say it plainly." Morrow arrived with 2 people Dorothy hadn't seen before, a woman with a tablet and a man with a document case. He was dressed the same way he had been in the space below the house, impeccably, without ostentation. He sat across the aisle and 2 rows back. He did not acknowledge Dorothy. The board chair, a woman in her 60s named Audrey Fenn, called the session to order at 6:30 with the brisk efficiency of someone who ran these meetings regularly and had learned to respect the time of everyone in the room. She reviewed the agenda. Item 4 was the matter of a request from Morrow Development, LLC, to initiate a preliminary eminent domain review of a parcel in the rural southwest of the county. When item 4 was reached, the chair asked Morrow's representative to present first. The woman with the tablet stood and spoke for 9 minutes. She was precise and well-prepared, and she presented the case for the eminent domain review with the smooth competence of someone who had made presentations like this many times: the land's unregistered status, the potential for development that would serve county interests, the legal mechanisms available under Ohio eminent domain statute, the assurance that Morrow Development, LLC, was prepared to compensate fairly and efficiently. Then the chair looked at Dorothy. Mrs. Harlan, you've indicated you wish to address the board on this matter. Dorothy stood. She had a single sheet of paper in her hand, the one-page summary Lenora had prepared. She looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at the 5 board members. She looked at the 30 people in the seats around her. She looked at Morrow, who was looking at her with the same steady, patient reasonableness he had shown in the underground space, and she thought, he has been in this room before. He knows exactly what he is doing here. He has the practice of someone who operates in these rooms professionally. She had never been in a room like this in her life. She thought about Walter. She thought about what he had said to Earl in 2012. I need someone who knows how to build. I'll provide the materials. You tell me if the design is sound. She thought about the way he had approached every difficult thing, find out what the structure requires, then provide what's necessary for it to stand. The structure here required plain truth. She began to speak. My husband, Walter Harlan, bought 12 acres of land in the southwest of this county in April of 2012, she said. He bought it in my name. He didn't tell me he'd done it. I found out 3 days ago when I opened a metal box that had been sitting under a floorboard for 12 years. A small sound in the room, not laughter, something quieter. The sound of people paying attention. He built a space on that land, she continued, underground, below a small house, because underground spaces are warmer in winter and cooler in summer and can be maintained with less infrastructure. He built it well, I've seen it, and whoever designed it understood what they were doing. And for 12 years, he quietly made that space available to people who needed a place to be when they didn't have one. She paused. Not people who had made bad decisions, or people who had given up, or people who needed to be fixed. Just people who had run out of road. A carpenter who got hurt on the bow and couldn't work anymore and couldn't pay his medical bills. A woman who lost her house in a legal dispute. A retired factory worker with nowhere to go after an industrial accident. She paused again. People who needed time, just time, somewhere to be while they figured out what came next. She looked at the board chair. Walter never told anyone he'd built it, she said. He never applied for permits or nonprofit status or any form of recognition. Not because he was hiding from accountability, but because he understood that the moment something like this becomes official, the moment it goes on a record and gets an address and becomes a named thing, it stops being available to the people it's meant for and starts being managed for the benefit of the systems that manage it. She let that sit for a moment. I spent 37 years as a school administrator, she said. I manage systems. I know what they do to the things they touch. Some things survive it, some things don't. She looked at Morrow's chair, then back at the board. My husband spent 12 years protecting something that doesn't survive being touched by the kind of interest Mr. Morrow represents. Not because Mr. Morrow is a bad person, but because what he does to land is converted into something profitable. And what this land is for is the opposite of profitable. It's for the people who aren't profitable. The ones that systems, including well-intentioned ones, tend to look through rather than at. The room was quiet. I have the deed, Dorothy said. I have the recorded document from 2012. The land is mine not as an inheritance, not as a bequest, but as a property Walter transferred to me the year we were 3 years married, in a legal transaction recorded with this county's own recorder's office. I have that document with me tonight if the board wishes to review it. She reached into her coat pocket and placed it on the table in front of the board chair. I'm asking the board to decline this request, she said. Not because of the legal question, though I believe the legal question is settled. I'm asking because sometimes the right question isn't what does the law allow, but what does this place need to remain? what it is. She paused one final time. And what it needs is to stay off the record, the way my husband built it, the way it's been for 12 years. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment, not the performing quiet of people waiting for the next thing, but the real quiet of a room that has received something and is letting it settle. Morrow's representative requested an opportunity to respond. The board chair allowed it. The woman spoke for 4 minutes, covering legal procedure and county interest and the need for a formal review process. She was competent and thorough and completely correct about the procedural points she was making. It didn't matter. The board deliberated for 11 minutes in a side room. They returned and voted 4-1 to decline the request for a preliminary eminent domain review, citing insufficient demonstration of public benefit, sufficient to override established private deed rights. Morrow found her in the parking lot afterward. She had expected this. She had gone to her car deliberately not to leave, but because she had understood watching him during the hearing that he would want a final word and that she would rather have it outside in the dark where there was no audience for either of them. He approached from across the lot. He walked the same way he always walked, with the patience of a man who was never in a hurry because he had learned that time generally moved in his direction. He stopped a few feet from her. "You prepared well," he said. "I told the truth," she said. "It didn't require much preparation." He was quiet for a moment. "You know this isn't finished," he said. Not as a threat, but as a statement of practical fact, the kind he seemed to prefer. "The title cloud on the property isn't going to resolve cleanly. Lenora Vance is good, but quiet title actions take time, and in that time there are moves available to me." "I know," Dorothy said. "And you're still not going to sell?" "No." He looked at her for a moment in the darkness of the parking lot. The security vehicle was gone. He had withdrawn it after the board vote, the same efficient recalculation he had applied to everything throughout this process. Morrow was not a man who threw good money after bad decisions. He knew when a position had become untenable, and he adjusted. What she saw in his face right now was not defeat. It was something more complicated than defeat, the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't expected and was still processing what to do with that information. "Your husband," he said. "When I spoke to him 3 years ago, he said something I've thought about." He paused. "He said some land is worth more standing still than it is developed. I told him that was sentiment, not economics." Another pause. "I'm not certain he was wrong." Dorothy looked at him. "He wasn't," she said. Morrow looked at her for a moment longer. Then he gave a small nod, not concession, not agreement, but the acknowledgement of a man who knew when a conversation had arrived at its actual end, and he walked back across the parking lot to his car. Dorothy watched him go. Then she got into her own car and sat in the dark for a while, not going anywhere, just sitting with the quiet fact of what had happened. Prescott called the following week. Lenora had filed a second document with the county recorder by then, and Prescott's lawyer had reviewed it and apparently explained to him what it meant. The call was brief. His voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been told by an expert that a position he was committed to is not tenable and is still adjusting to that information. He said he would not pursue the marital agreement challenge further. Dorothy thanked him and ended the call. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in the way that follows sustained effort, a tiredness that was also underneath a kind of relief. The relief of a structure that has been under load for a long time finally being allowed to simply stand. The days that followed were quiet. Lenora continued the quiet title process. It would take months, she had warned, but it would resolve cleanly. In the meantime, Dorothy had what she needed: the deed, the board decision, and Morrow's visible withdrawal from active pressure. The security vehicle did not return. Dorothy moved properly into the small room at the back of the house, above the underground space, the room Walter had apparently used on his weekend visits, based on the single blanket folded on the narrow bed. The small mirror hung at the right height for a man of his height, rather than hers. The coffee can on the windowsill that still held 2 pencils and a folded piece of graph paper with a structure sketched on it that she recognized looking at it carefully as an early version of the space below. He had designed it in this room. He had looked out this window at these trees while he drew the plans. He had come here on weekends for years and built something with his hands and his weekends and a portion of his savings in a decision she had never been asked to ratify. She hung the small mirror a little lower. She left the pencils and the graph paper where they were. In the evening, she sat with Earl and Ruth and Patricia and James around the small table, and they talked carefully at first, then more easily the way conversation opens up between people once the formal reasons for caution have passed. She learned more about each of them. She told them things about herself, about the school she had worked at for 22 years, about the particular difficulty of being the person who kept the administrative machinery running when the machinery was not quite adequate for what it was being asked to do. About Claire in Portland, who had called twice during the proceedings and whom Dorothy had talked to honestly for perhaps the first time in years about where she was and what she was doing and why. Claire had been quiet for a long time after Dorothy finished explaining. Then she had said, "Mom, that's the most like yourself I've ever heard you sound." Dorothy had thought about that for several days afterward. She wasn't certain Claire was right, but she wasn't certain she was wrong. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, 3 weeks after the board meeting, Dorothy was on the porch of the house when she heard a car slow on the county road. She had developed a new habit, a different relationship to sounds than she'd had before all of this. She listened now, not anxiously, but with the particular attention of someone who had learned that sounds carried information worth receiving. The car stopped, an engine off, a door. She stood up from the porch chair, one of two she had found stored in the back of the house, dragged out and placed facing the clearing, with the intention of using them in the warmer months, which were still a long way off, and looked toward the tree line. A woman appeared at the edge of the clearing. She was perhaps 55, 56. She stood at the margin of the open ground, the way people stand when they are uncertain of their welcome. Weight slightly backhands visible, the posture of someone who has learned not to assume. She carried a canvas bag that had the specific look of a bag that contained everything that currently mattered to its owner. She looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at her. The woman opened her mouth and closed it again. She looked around the clearing, taking in the small house, the porch, the woman standing on it. Her expression was the particular mixture of hope and humiliation that appears on people's faces when they are asking for something they have never had to ask for before and aren't sure the asking is allowed. Dorothy stepped down from the porch. She crossed the clearing, slowly, not hurrying, not because she was indifferent, but because she had learned from Earl, from Ruth, from the quality of care Walter had built into every element of this place, that the right pace for receiving someone was unhurried. That arriving too quickly could feel like pursuit. That the space between two people when one of them was uncertain needed to be crossed at the right speed. She stopped a few feet from the woman. "You don't need to explain anything," Dorothy said. Her voice came out quiet and level, the voice she had found over the past 3 weeks, different from the voice she'd had before, steadier, with less performance in it. "You don't need to have a reason that sounds like enough." The woman looked at her. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. She was doing what people do when they were working very hard not to, which is a different thing. "I wasn't sure," the woman said. "I wasn't sure this was the right place. I wasn't sure I had the right address." She paused. "I wasn't sure I was supposed to be here." Dorothy looked at her for a moment. She thought about a parking lot at a supermarket in Kenton. She thought about the cold in the car at 3 in the morning and the sound of a shopping cart rolling loose across empty concrete. She thought about standing at the edge of a clearing in November with a canvas bag and no idea what she was walking toward. "Neither was I," she said. She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "It's warmer inside." The woman looked at her for another moment, at that last moment, before a person lets themselves accept something they've needed for a long time. Then something in her posture changed, just slightly. The weight settled differently. The held breath released. She walked forward. Dorothy turned and walked with her toward the house across the clearing that the world had decided did not exist in the late afternoon light of a November that was almost over, toward the warmth of a place that was still and would remain exactly what Walter had built it to be. Not a house, not property, not an asset or a parcel or a development opportunity. A place where people who had run out of road could stop, rest, find the question they needed before they could use the answer. Dorothy held the door open. The woman walked through, and on a Thursday afternoon in Hardin County, Ohio, the door of a small house closed quietly behind two people, and the clearing went still, and the trees stood where they had always stood, and the ground held what it had always held, and the address that didn't exist on any map remained exactly where it had always been, waiting for whoever needed it next.